OpenAI just released a goldmine of opportunity for entrepreneurs and coders alike, thanks to the ChatGPT Apps SDK. Now we'll have the ability to build our own apps that will run inside of ChatGPT. So if we want specific context that only applies to us and our projects or our work, we will be able to do that with this Apps SDK. Instead of copying and pasting things or wrangling all these different tools together, we can just write out a few basic fundamental functions, wrap them up or wire them up with MCP and the ChatGPT App SDK, and then boom, our ChatGPT sessions will be that much better. Let me just show you a really simple example as to why you might want to take this course even further. Inside of ChatGPT, I want to talk to my app, so all I need to do is say the @ and then type out my app name, and then I can add something in like predict the value of this with my tool, hit enter. What it's going to do here is it's going to go ahead and attempt to use this tool. Now, what's happening here is it's going to look for this code right here. So this is some very simple Python code that's running here, and the actual tool it's looking for is this function right here. Now, the reason that ChatGPT knows about this is all of the wiring we do. It's not really that complicated, but then it also understands this little string right here. It looks for that specific thing, and in which case it will look for that function. It's going to call predict with those arguments. Now, for those of you who are not nearly as technical, the idea here is everything's sort of matching, and the LLMs are getting so good, ChatGPT and otherwise, are getting so good at recognizing patterns, and then MCP is giving the actual context, the correct stuff, so that these functions can be called basically anywhere. The ChatGPT Apps SDK is the first move in making this possible inside of the ChatGPT itself without using any third-party tool, which is pretty exciting. So we're going to go ahead and remember this conversation. I'll go ahead and hit confirm. Now it's going to call the tool with that argument that I gave it here as context. And then eventually my code is going to return back a result from that prediction. And then ChatGPT is going to know about the result, and then it will go ahead and make sense of it, right? So there's the tool call, there's that result. And then I can say, does this result mean anything to you? And naturally, I could always give it real stuff, right? If I were to give it real stuff, then ChatGPT would have that context and be able to do all sorts of other things on here like you might want it to, which is so cool. Now, of course, this is only really scratching the surface as to what you can do with MCP, what you can do with the ChatGPT Apps SDK, but it's a good start. And so we use the tool called FastMCP, which is a Python tool. I'll talk about all of the tech stack very, very soon. Now, if this is exciting to you, stick with me on this course so you can actually build out your own app that provides context to ChatGPT as you see fit using that new Apps SDK. Now, I will say, if you want to go a lot more advanced, go to this link right here, answer a few questions, because I'm going to be doing so much more to help build out the future of what these ChatGPT apps can do, and more importantly, what you can do with them. Thanks for watching. My name is Justin Mitchell. Let's go ahead and dive into the course right now. The very first thing I want to do is verify that I can turn on developer mode inside of ChatGPT so I can actually build an app. So what this looks like is in chatgpt.com, you click on your user account, you hit settings, under apps and connectors, scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see this advanced settings here, and then you can actually click developer mode on, and in which case it actually gives you this orange thing around the chat and memory is turned off. Now, I think this is going to change in the near future as to how all of this works, how you turn on developer mode and all that. But for now, this is what it looks like. So going back into settings, I can turn this off at any time, which will disable access to any sort of app that you're building, which of course is what we're doing in this one. Now, another thing about this is as soon as you turn on developer mode and you go back into apps and connectors, what you'll end up seeing is this create button in that apps tab. If you see that create button, you'll be able to click it and we will be able to build out a new connector. I think this process will change very soon, if not already by the time you're looking at this. But the point here is you want to be able to build an app and add in an MCP server URL. Now, this is not the only place to do this. I'll show you another place in just a moment, but I also want to show you what it looks like when this stuff's not there. So on a free account at chatgpt.com, I open up my user, I hit settings, and I can see apps and connectors is still there. At this point, maybe it does say create and you are able to use it. But in my case, I can't. I actually can't create an app in here. So what I might have to do is spend $5 to use the OpenAI API platform, which will allow for you to do something very similar to what you're doing in ChatGPT. I'm going to show you that in the video as well. But the idea here is you go into OpenAI, platform.openai.com, you click on the dashboard, you go into chat, you go to create a new chat, and then you'll see this tools here, and we'll be able to create an MCP server, which is going to be very similar to what we saw in ChatGPT. It's not identical. They do work slightly different, which I'll talk about later. But the point here is you need to be able to do either one of these things before you do the rest of this course. Now that you can do that, for those of you who can, let's continue to actually setting up our very first MCP server. Now that we have developer mode on in ChatGPT, or we have access in the OpenAI platform, we're now going to build out our Python MCP server. Now, this process is actually really easy to do, as you'll see in just a moment. But the idea is you need to download Python at least 3.10 or above, maybe even 3.11 or above. I'm going to be using 3.14, the newest version of Python. I'm also going to be using a Cloudflare tunnel. A tunnel is absolutely required to make this happen. You don't have to use a Cloudflare one. I have this whole other video right here that you can watch that shows you other options for building out your own tunnel. It only takes a few minutes to get a tunnel up and running, and once you have one, you'll be able to use it all of the time. Now, the reason we need a tunnel is so that we have a public URL that we can bring to ChatGPT that we can use as our MCP server. So if we look in our apps and connectors here, we've got this MCP server. We need a way for ChatGPT to actually communicate with our local machine. A tunnel will help us do that. Python will help us build out the actual MCP server itself with a tool called FastMCP. FastMCP is great. It is different than another tool called FastAPI. We'll get into that later. We'll actually combine them later as well, but the idea is we want to do this hello world of FastMCP inside of our project here so that ChatGPT can talk to it. Go ahead and open up your command line, terminal if you're on Mac or Linux, PowerShell potentially if you're on Windows. The idea here is you want to just verify that your version of Python is installed. I'm using 3.14 or 3.14. Now, you could also use Cursor for this for the exact same thing and just type out whatever your version is there. I want to create something called a Python virtual environment. There's a couple of different ways on how to do this. I use the one that's built into Python, which is called VENV. This will help us isolate our project from any other Python project on our machine, including things you might not know about. The idea here, though, is I'm going to go ahead and make a directory on my local machine with /dev. This is going to be where I put all of my developed projects in there. Next one is going to be like my ChatGPT MCP first, like very first one with those dashes, all of that. Then I'm going to go ahead and navigate into this folder. So we do CD into that folder, list it out, and there we go. Now, of course, I can now jump into Cursor if I want to and bring it open, and I would see the exact same folder in there and all of that. I will use Cursor at some point, but all we're doing right now is creating a virtual environment, and that is going to be using Python 3-m VENV VENV, hit enter. This will create your virtual environment for you. All you need to do then is activate it with source VENV bin/activate. If you're on a Windows, it's probably going to be something more like /scripts/activate. And yes, you have to do this every time you start working in this environment. If you close out the terminal, that's totally fine. You just need to reactivate it. Make sure you are nice and active in there. Now, in my case, what I like to do is run pip install pip and then a tool I created called rav that just helps us remember all of the different commands that we might want to remember. So I start off with this and then I run the other installations, which we'll do again, but the idea is pip install FastMCP, FastAPI, and something called uviacorn, and that's it. Those are going to be the installations we want. And if you finish this correctly, what you will end up seeing is all of these installed in your virtual environment, which I'm going to show you both things happening on your virtual environment and also out of your virtual environment itself. So while that's running, I'm going to open up a new tab and just do Python 3-m pip freeze and hit enter, and I see nothing. If I do that same thing with the virtual environment activated and do pip freeze in here, I can see there's a lot of things going on in here, especially the main ones, which is FastAPI and FastMCP. So our environment is now set up for our Python project. It's now time to just do some code. I'm now jumping into Cursor, which of course is a code editor. It does have AI features. I'm not going to be using any of them. Feel free to do them as you see fit. We're now going to create our MCP server. It's a very straightforward process. And of course, you could always copy and paste the code from the docs, but I'm going to show you how it's done from scratch. So the idea is inside of Cursor, we're going to go ahead and open a project. In my case, I put my project in a dev folder and then in ChatGPT MCP first. That's where my project is. I see that my virtual environment folder's in there because we set that up already. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. I will close out the chat here. I'm not going to be using that. And Cursor tab is also disabled in my case. So if I open up the terminal window, which is just doing Control tilde, and get used to toggling this because it's something you'll probably do a lot, what you'll notice is the virtual environment is not activated. So if I do Python 3-m pip freeze, I'll see that there's nothing installed. So again, we have to remember we need to activate it. So source venv bin/activate, and you hit enter. Again, if you're on Windows, it's probably something more like this, where it's venv scripts activate like that. That will probably activate it for you. Okay, so with this activated, we can once again check that pip freeze shows me all of these things. And I can also do, once again, Python 3-m pip freeze for those of you who didn't see me do that yet inside of the virtual environment, at least. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to create a Python module. We need to create our very first Python project. So the way I do this is I put all of my Python code into something called SRC. So in SRC, I'm going to go ahead and create a new module in here. I'm just going to call this mcp.py. That's it. Now, the reason I'm calling it mcp.py is because I'm not importing anything called MCP. Instead, what I'm importing is something called FastMCP, and we're going to import the FastMCP class. Then we're going to declare an MCP server with the name of MCP, FastMCP, like that. So right off the bat, I already have a namespace issue that could come up in your app or in your case. So we've got mcp.py and MCP right here. I don't want that to happen, so I'll change this to just simply MCP1. I think this happens a lot with people newer to writing out code. That is something you just want to be aware of. Those namespace issues do come up. And the fact that this is the first look at the code, I'm calling it 01. So what is it that we're trying to do here? Well, I declared a FastMCP server. What I want to do with MCP, it's all about adding tools. Now, tools themselves can be really, really simple, but there are a few things that you need to be aware of. When you create a tool, you're basically creating a Python function. So let's say, for instance, we're going to use their example of adding two numbers. We'll use an A and a B, and then we'll return something back from that. As you may know, in Python, it's really simple to add. You just do those two variables and then you add them together. That is an adding function. It's not really that good of a function because, well, why would you be doing this in the first place? Why would you be calling something instead of just writing out A plus B? That's not really the point. The point here is to see the very first look at what an MCP tool is. Now, these tools are really foundational, not just for MCP, but for AI agents. So if you were to look at something like LangChain and LangGraph, you can use these tools in those platforms as well. Those are outside the scope of this one, but the idea is each function itself we can think of as a tool. But when it comes to the tool itself, we want to be very explicit as to what we're expecting from that function. So for example, when we add two numbers together, well, we are assuming that they are two numbers. So we would want to make them the data type of int. So we do :int. So this is now saying that that's the data type that it is, as opposed to something like string. If we're trying to add a string and a number together, That might be something you do. I don't know. In our case, we want to add two numbers together. We want to be very explicit about that. What we also want to do is we also want to be explicit about what's coming back, which will be also an integer itself. Now, the what's coming back is not nearly as important as what's coming in as it relates to the MCP. Best practices, it's probably very important to always have these data types declared. But in our case, we really just want to make sure that we're doing the parameters, the arguments that are coming into the function as the main things that we need to know. The next part of this is to declare as a string as to what's happening here. So we're going to go ahead and say add two numbers, and that's it. That's essentially what's happening. Now you could also add additional explanation as to what's going on here, but this is the basis for a tool. Because how the LLM, or in this case ChatGPT, is going to know about these things is it's going to read what the description is and also the arguments that are going into it and those data types. ChatGPT will know about all of that stuff. That's what MCP servers do really well. Now, what we want to do then is after we have our function declared and some of our baseline stuff ready, we can now use this MCP variable as a decorator with mcp.tool. And now it is a FastMCP tool. This is not a tool for anything else. So if you wanted to have multiple tools used multiple times, let's say for instance, let's define my other tool, or let's call it my main add tool. You could basically do the same exact thing in here, my main add tool. And then down here, you would just return back that same thing. So this would then mean you could use this with other tooling, like if you were using the LangChain or LangGraph. That's sort of the idea there. Naturally, that's outside the scope of this one, but I just wanted you to be aware of it, that these tools don't have to be only stuck with FastMCP. You can reuse them, and it is something that you'll want to be aware of and build towards. But at its core, the basic function of a tool is this right here. So now we want to be able to run this as a server. Now that we have a tool, obviously we could build a lot more, but what we want to do here is I'm going to run the Python module directly, which means that I'm going to go ahead and do something called if name equals to main. Then we'll go ahead and run mcp.run and a transport of HTTP. Okay. So we want to make sure that this is working with as an HTTP server. And then we also want to declare a port value in here, which mine's going to be 8123. Now, the reason mine is that specific port and yours might be something different has everything to do with the fact of my tunnel. I'm using the Cloudflare tunnel and I'm tunneling to the port of 8123. Thus, this is that same one. I'm now going to go ahead and save it. We're going to go ahead and run this with Python src, and that's ibcp01.py, and we hit enter, and this will run that command for us, and we see this right here. Congratulations, you have your first MCP server. And so in my case, I've got the streamable HTTP, and it's available right here. Now, of course, if I try to give this to ChatGPT as my server, ChatGPT might allow me to do this. Let's try it out. I'm going to go ahead and say hungry pie tool. Just some arbitrary name there. I'm going to turn off authentication. I don't have authentication, and I'm going to go ahead and trust this application in here. And there we go. I'm going to hit create, and it might actually allow for me to bring this in. Nope, unsafe URL. Right off the bat, it doesn't allow for that. So with my actual Cloudflare tunnel, I can use my tunnel in here instead, which in my case, it's share.hungrypie.com, and then I can go to /MCP, and there we go. I get some response. It's not an error, it's something. Seems like it's an error. It's an error from like a website perspective, but it's not an error from the MCP one. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that same URL with that tunnel in there. This is why it's so critical. I go ahead and hit create, and now it should allow for me to connect to that connector for this particular tool. Okay, and there we go. After a few moments, there is my tool right there. I can delete it at any time. I can also refresh different actions or different tools that I can have in here. I say tool a lot, but this is MCP server, right? So this is my MCP server app, and then the tool itself is the functions that are in there that ChatGPT will be able to call. Okay, so what I want to do here now is I want to call that tool. So I'm going to go ahead and add it in by doing @ and then the tool name itself, and then I'll go ahead and say add 39 and 10, right? And so what it should do is it should call my tool. Now it might call it incorrectly. So let's go ahead and try this again. Use the Hungry Pi tool to add 39 and 10. Okay. And so in this case, adding something, ChatGPT is smart. It will be able to add something. It's not really that complicated. But now here it goes. It's now saying, hey, it wants to talk to this tool. You can say, remember for this conversation, just go ahead and call it, and we'll hit confirm. Now, what's really interesting about this is it's showing the different arguments and the names of those variables. And of course, it gives back the same result in there. I'm going to try it again with something different. This time, I'm going to go ahead and change this and multiply it by some weird number, right? So obviously, that is not the correct adding of this number. I'm going to go ahead and restart my server with Control-C and just rerun it again, and then we'll try it again. And let's say do it again with the tool and use the tool's result. Okay, so now ChatGPT should call it once again to my actual tool. So how this is working is ChatGPT servers are communicating through my tunnel directly to my server. As you can see, a bunch of results are happening in here, and then those things will come back. Here is the result. It's a ridiculous number for adding things, but it is showing that this stuff is working. Then, of course, I can ask ChatGPT, is this the correct answer? And of course, ChatGPT is going to say, no, it's incorrect. Math is very obvious to check, and ChatGPT is actually really good at it, and it's only getting better. The point here, though, is our code is now providing context directly to ChatGPT, to that experience. And the experience starts to feel very similar to other things. We're in here and we're like, can you add the numbers 10 and 20 at Hungry Pi using the tool? You might need to specify that with something like simplistic, like adding those two numbers. But the idea here is I can just write out natural text in how I use ChatGPT. And I would guess that the voice agent stuff is going to happen very soon too, where it's going to say, hey, we're going to call the tool and figure it out for you, right? And so there it is. This is so cool. This unlocks so much stuff. Now for me, I would say, hey, if you want to build out your FastMCP more from here, by all means, go for it. This is a very simple example on purpose. Now, of course, ChatGPT is not the only place we can use MCP with OpenAI. So what I want to do is I want to bring my MCP server over into the chat platform. So platform.openai.com. Inside of chat here, we can go ahead and create another new chat, and I can add in my tool here as an MCP server. We'll go ahead and add that server in here, add in the URL. We can give it some sort of label, like let's go ahead and say Hungry Pi MCP server. And then I'm going to go ahead, you can give it a description if you want. We do not need authentication. I'll go ahead and hit connect. The only reason I don't have authentication yet is it's a little bit more advanced than what I want to cover at this time. But here we go. We've got an approval in here that's saying always require for these tools. I'll just go ahead and say yes for now. I'm also going to go ahead and say always use the Hungry Pi MCP server tools results. Do not change them. Okay. Now inside of my prompt, I'll actually go ahead and save this one too. And we'll go ahead and say MCP tests, publish. This is published in our own app. It's not like a public app at this point. You can build it inside of OpenAI's client. In other words, you can integrate all of this right inside of your own app in addition to using your MCP server or anyone else's. I'm not going to do that at this point. I'm just going to use the chat right inside of OpenAI. And so I'll chat with this prompt and I'll go ahead and say add 10 and 40, 430 or something like that. This should automatically call the tool. It might not. The reason it might not is because something as generic as add may or may not actually register as, hey, it should be calling the tool. But here we go. It actually did do it, which is great. So it's asking me to approve this request. I'm going to go ahead and approve it, and then it's going to run through that process. So what I could also do is just change it to never require that tool call and just update that to where it will just automatically do it, right? And of course, it also depends, the speed also depends on how fast my tunnel and my own app and my own internet connection, The speed here depends on a lot of different factors to make this work. So to make it work better, you would go into production. You would put it on a cloud server of some kind. It will be a lot faster when you get there for responding to ChatGPT. This isn't super slow considering what it's doing with the chat and all that, but there it goes. It actually gave me that result. So once I actually changed the tool here, I could go ahead and run this again. And once again, it's probably going to take a little bit of time because, of course, it's communicating over the internet to my stuff, responding back and doing all that sort of stuff. So do keep that in mind. Now, this is actually really cool. It's a nice, easy way to test this out. And of course, if you didn't have ChatGPT Plus, you would probably have to do it in here anyway. But the process is very straightforward. Now, the big difference between doing it inside of platform.openai.com and ChatGPT has to do with the authentication. So if you come in here, when you go to create it, you've got this OAuth authentication here. What you can do is you can add in OAuth. Now, that link I shared before about advanced, ChatGPT SDK apps, like the actual course and all the other stuff we're doing, make sure you sign up for that link to learn more advanced stuff like authentication. But the thing is, with ChatGPT itself, it will actually do the OAuth process for you. So let's say, for instance, you have login with Google, it will actually start that process for you, hold on to those tokens, and actually authenticate that way for you. Whereas in the platform itself doesn't have that, at least yet. So if you go into the MCP server again, you actually have to provide a token or headers in there directly, which actually makes a whole lot of sense because this chat itself is meant to be embedded in some other software program. So then you would just be using it at that point as well. So that's kind of a little bit different. That's the difference between the two when you're testing these things out. Obviously, we didn't go into the authentication stuff yet, but it is something that's actually very, very interesting, of course. Now, the other part about MCP in general is it's not only for ChatGPT and OpenAI. Hopefully you realize that, but I think it was Anthropic that actually pioneered the Model Context Protocol, or MCP, and then it just became the standard all across the board. So that means that Anthropic Claude will likely have something very similar to what you're seeing with ChatGPT. If that happens and you guys want to see a video about it, let me know in the comments below. I now want to combine my FastMCP server with FastAPI. If you're not familiar with FastAPI, it's a web application framework that is very, very popular, and it works a lot like what we've done with FastMCP. Now, one of the reasons you might end up doing FastAPI is maybe you want to build out a user-facing web application. FastAPI might power it for you, so you have your own website and all that sort of stuff. Now, FastAPI also has a lot of documentation on how to use it with something like SQL models, so you actually can store data into a database. So once you have a FastAPI application, you could then easily bring it into FastMCP. Now, I think a lot of these features do overlap, so it's not like you will always need to do both of them like this. But to me, it's a very interesting way to look at it and also a very compelling way to move forward. So let's take a look at how to build out a FastAPI application with FastMCP. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to jump back into our cursor here. I'm going to bring in requirements.txt. I want to bring in all of the requirements I need. So FastAPI, FastMCP. We need something called UVicorn, which is a web server gateway interface for us. And then I also have in Rav in here. I'll show you that in just a second. But the idea then is we've got these requirements here. Let's just go ahead and make sure that we've got them all running. I'm going to hit Control-C to close out my server, and I'll do pip install requirements.txt, or rather pip install -r requirements.txt, and run that just to make sure everything is up and going. Now, inside of SRC here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to call this main.py. This is a very common way to name FastAPI, which would be in main.py. So I'll go ahead and do from FastAPI, we're going to import the FastAPI app, and we're going to go ahead and declare our API with simply API equaling to FastAPI, and then I'll go ahead and do the decorator of API.get with a slash there, and then we'll define the function as read root, and then I'll return back a Python dictionary, and we'll just go ahead and do hello and world, and that's it. Okay, so why is it that I have this very simplistic FastAPI application? Well, it's so that we can see how this runs, and then we'll bring in the MCP of it all. So what I want to do to make it run is I'll create something called rav.yaml, and I'll go ahead and do scripts here. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a script for the command dev. I'm going to show you how to do this in just a moment. This script itself will cd into the src folder, and it will go ahead and run /venv bin/uviacorn, and then it'll go ahead and grab main, which of course is main.py, and then we're going to go ahead and use the app itself, which I think I called it API. So let's go ahead and rename it back to simply app, just like that. And I'll call this main:app. Then we're going to go ahead and do --reload. We're going to go ahead and host it at 0.0.0. And then I'm also going to add in my port of 8123. Great. So this command right here will be ran on my local machine. If you're on Windows, you'll probably have to change how this command works. In fact, uviacorn might not even work, so you might have to use something like waitress if you're on Windows. But for the rest of us, I think uviacorn works just fine. If it does work, uviacorn, please let me know in the comments. But the idea here now is I can run rav run and simply dev, and it will run this entire command. That's kind of the point. That's why we have rav in there, just to remember that command, because it's not really that easy to run. If we do our MCP app only, something like that, then it's cd src and python, and then it was what? MCP 01.py, and that will do exactly what we did before as well. You don't necessarily have to cd in there, but I like doing that, and I'll also like doing this directly so that it's all using the correct stuff. Nevertheless, I now have this new port here, so what I can do is I can go to share.hungrypie.com, and I see that hello world. So that's FastAPI in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and combine FastAPI with FastMCP. I'm going to go ahead and grab my MCP stuff, basically everything other than this if__name. I'll go ahead and grab that, and we'll paste it in here. So how this is going to end up working is we actually will need two versions of FastAPI running here. The very first one is going to be the actual API. We'll call this API is FastAPI, and then we will pass this in to MCP itself by actually going in here and doing .from FastAPI and passing in that app itself. Okay, and so then this app here is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be stored down here. We'll come back to it in a second, but the actual API itself will still be called that. So we've got our FastAPI app as our REST API, and then we got our FastMCP app as our MCP server, right? And so what we want to do now is we want to actually bring in the MCP app itself. So we'll go ahead and do something like this, where it's MCP app equals to mcp.http app, and then we'll go ahead and give it a path of /MCP. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. Okay, so not a whole lot of changes just yet. The main change is going to be how we actually run both of these things in tandem, and that's going into our final declaration of the FastAPI application, which will give us, we'll say a title, and I'll go ahead and say Hungry Pie MCP app or something like that. Then I'll go ahead and bring in my routes. So this is the key part here. The routes are going to take in two different routes. First off, we're going to take in the route from our MCP app. So we'll go ahead and do MCP app.routes, and we want to unpack them. So I'll go ahead and put a star in front of here. So basically this is a list of routes, and I just unpack them so that they are combined within these routes. And I want to do that same thing with app.routes. So, or API.routes rather. So the original API of FastAPI. Great. So these are going to be the routes. Next up, I want to make sure that my MCP server has something called lifespan. The lifespan itself needs to be inside of here. So we'll do mcapp.lifespan. Now this lifespan gives the actual FastAPI application the session for MCP. It's quite literally required. Those of you who know FastAPI might already go, wait a minute, but how do I bring in my FastAPI lifespan? We'll take a look at that in just a moment. But for now, we have now a REST API and an MCP server. Let's take a look at how to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and save everything. I'm going to close down my old server here, and I'll go ahead and run it again. Once again, it's that command. And now what we've got is using both of these things in one place. So let's go ahead and verify that this works by going into SharePie or share.hungrypie.com, my actual tunnel, and then also going into the MCP one. And there we go. So we've got that same error we saw before with the actual MCP server. So if we were to change this path to, let's say, for instance, our SSE or something like that, and refresh in here, now it gives us not found, and we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And then we'll go ahead and refresh in here, and now it gives us not found, and we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. And we would have to change that path to something like SSE. and make sure I spell it right. And there we go. So that's where that path comes in, but I'm gonna leave it in as MCP because that's what I've been using. And so this also means that I probably could add in more instances of the MCP server, which I think is well outside the scope of what we're doing here. And whether or not you want to do that is a whole different story. But the idea here is we now have a combined version, right? It's using both things. Let's go ahead and test this assumption with something more. I'll create another tool in here. And with that tool, we'll go ahead and create multiply. And now it's going to go ahead and do that same thing. But this time we'll go ahead and actually multiply things and then, multiply it some more. And then we'll go ahead and multiply some two numbers. Great. Not a very good function, but it is one that is a tool. Going back into ChatGPT now, we'll go back into our connector here. I want to refresh my tools here. So yet another place as to why we would want to know about this is because your actual tools themselves, you might need to refresh them from time to time so they have the updated information. There it is. Now we've got multiply two numbers. I'm going to go ahead and create a new chat here, and I'll go ahead and bring in Hungry Pie tool. Let's go ahead and do multiply, this and this with the tool. We'll hit enter, and let's see what happens. So naturally, it is still running the MCP server stuff. All of these requests are similar to what we saw before when it was just MCP, and there we go. So that's the product of it. Let's see if it does the analysis. It did not use the tool, so you didn't use the tool or its results. So let's go ahead and try that again, knowing that ChatGPT did not do the tool. So maybe I need to say the actual tool in my prompt. That might actually make it a little bit better. But here it goes, looking for available tools. And of course, it's probably going to end up finding it. I'll let it finish. Oh, there it goes. And I'll go ahead and confirm it for this entire conversation. And there we go. We got an error in here. It's not an integer. That's because our response here will never be an integer, where this one up here would. So let's change this to float, for example, and let's try it again. And we'll go ahead and try again and hit enter. And let's see if it calls the tool. It looks like it's loading. I'll let it finish. And so it finished, and of course the result is wrong, and it shows us that, but the actual MCP server itself is working, which of course now we've got our MCP server and we've got a REST API. I think that's pretty great. One of the things I mentioned in that last part had to do with lifespan. Now, when it comes to integrating to, let's say, a database, you will need to use this lifespan method inside of FastAPI, which means you'll probably also need to use it inside of the MCP app itself. But the thing is, FastMCP already has a lifespan. It already does something for that. So what we need to look at is how can we have a combined lifespan? So to do this, we're going to go ahead and come in to our project here, and I'll bring in from context lib. We're going to import something called an async context manager. And then right below our app here, I'm going to go ahead and create this context manager. And I'll go ahead and define a function here. We'll go ahead and do async def, and we'll call this FastAPI lifespan. And it's going to take in a FastAPI app as its default. And then basically what it does is it yields something in here. And we also want to bring in our async context manager. So what the FastAPI lifespan does now is it's going to go ahead and run something before the app fully starts. Then the app starts. Then it's going to run something before, after the app ends. Some sort of cleanup method. Now, what FastAPI used to do for this was a startup event. So this is the old version. You'd have a startup event that would do some stuff, and then you'd have a shutdown event that would do some stuff. They are now combined together into this lifespan here. And so normally what you would do is you would use that lifespan and just pass it in to the FastAPI application directly. So what would you actually load up here? I mentioned the database. You might end up doing a database session. That's a little bit outside the scope of what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to use an example that the MCP documentation has, or FastMCP documentation, which is something along the lines of AI models or ML models, machine learning models. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up more towards the top because that's probably where you'll end up putting it. The idea then is we're going to go ahead and create a function up here, and I'm going to go ahead and say, answer to ML model everything or something like that. and it's going to take in some sort of value. I'll just go ahead and say float, like the docs say, and then I'm going to return back x times 42. And then I'm also going to go ahead and do ML models equals to just an empty dictionary. So what's going to happen here is we want to use this empty dictionary elsewhere. So in this lifespan, what I can do is right before it starts, I can actually just bring in this functionality here as I'll go ahead and say my ML model, and then I'll set it equal to that function. So this ML model now, what I should be able to do is call it somewhere else. So let's go ahead and do another MCP tool, and I'll go ahead and do define and call predict, and we'll go ahead and do x is a float, and then I'll go ahead and run that MCP model tool on x, and then the result being something along those lines, and then we'll return back that result, which will also be some sort of float. Okay, so there's one tool, one method as to how you might do it. Another method would be in the API itself, and we could do something like predict, and we'll go ahead and say do prediction, and again I'll do x. This time I'll do some sort of number, or we'll go ahead and do x equals to an integer, and there we go. So I'll leave that in as is, and then I'll once again give that result in here for that x, and we'll put it in like so. Okay, so now I have it in two places. Now we're not really going to test the MCP tool itself, but the idea is still there. So the question then is, how do I actually use this lifespan inside of my FastAPI project? Now, the way we do that is we create something called a global lifespan. So we're going to go ahead and do an async context manager, and I'll do async def global lifespan. I think the MCP one calls it like a combined lifespan. I'm just going to call it a global one, and it's an app for FastAPI. What it's going to do is it's going to do async with the FastAPI lifespan, that function that we created before, and then also async and with. This is now going to be our MCP app .lifespan of that same app, and then we just yield it, right? So it's a dual lifespan in here that we can now bring in down there. So it's quite a bit different than what it was, but it's just kind of a nested lifespan. So the FastAPI one at the highest level, then the MCP one right below that. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. We'll rerun this again. I'll just restart the server even though I had it running, and I'm just going to go into predict. So let's go ahead and do that with share hungry pie, and then I'll go /predict. It's going to say I need an argument in here. My x is not in there. So I'll go ahead and put x equals to, I don't know, some number in here. And there we go. So we get a result back. We could even try this as well. Let's go ahead and try it actually with these do prediction. So for the MCP tool, we'll go ahead and say, predict the results of a number. We'll give it that name. Might as well just try it. We'll save that. We'll go into our settings, of course, settings into our app connector here. Let's go ahead and refresh the different actions. And of course, that might take a moment. And there we go. We've got call predict. So let's go ahead and say predict the results of 32.1 and hit enter. And here it goes. It's trying to call that function. We hit confirm, and hopefully it will actually give us the results. I think it will. I don't see why it wouldn't at this point. But the idea here, of course, is we now have yet another way to actually do some different functions in here, right? And so that value, I think, is what would end up coming back. Obviously, you could test it, and you could do something like maybe predict the results of, let's do some other number that's not an actual float number and see what it does with that. But the idea overall is it is fully running these tools both places, right? The MCP and also the API, which is great. So it actually did call it as just a whole number, which is totally fine. And it gave back this number here, which also is totally fine based off of what it's actually trying to do, which is this right here. Pretty cool. So there we go. That is the shared lifespan. And naturally, what you would also be able to do with this is anything related to a database, which is something definitely worth checking out. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. Now, I will say there are 2 additional features that you'll need to do to make this even more useful inside of ChatGPT. The first one would be a user interface, actually learning some React.js so you can actually embed a React component right inside of ChatGPT so that you can add things like product listings or maybe images of your restaurant's food or whatever the case might be. Now, another part of it would be actually authenticating users, logging users in through a process called OAuth. Like you can get Google login to be connected into your FastMCP server, and then it'll just work. ChatGPT stores the token so that it can then re-access that user going forward. Now, there's still a lot of question marks to that since it's so new, but the idea here is there's still more things that can be done right inside of the ChatGPT app, which is why I gave you that survey earlier, which should be in the description as well for those of you who want to go a lot more advanced. Now, I will say ChatGPT apps are really laying the groundwork for other services to adopt something very similar. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if we hear from Claude or Anthropic that they're going to be doing the same thing, and maybe Grok as well, and pretty much any other service that already knows about MCP. This is just one more layer on top of it, and it was in many ways inevitable that it was going to happen. But now that it's here, it's really exciting, and I can't wait to do that much more with it. I kind of hope that you feel the same way. And if you do, let me know. I want to see what you're building in the description below or send me a DM. Either way, thanks again for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.